Welcome to Eating Europe, the podcast where we explore the heart of Europe through its food, its markets, and the stories behind every dish. I'm your host, Julia Doust, and if you've ever planned a trip around a meal, you're in the right place. Let's dig in. Today we're going to talk about tapas. What does tapas mean to you? What do you think of when you think of tapas? I know when I think of tapas, I think of evenings spent with friends round a bar with lots of little bits of food that we're all trying. I think of arguments about whether we're going to have the ham croquettes or the vegetable croquettes. I think of arguments about who says that black pudding isn't good and the others who think it's the best tapas ever. My memories of tapas go from various holidays in Spain. I remember going to Burgos where my daughter tasted croquettes for the first time, and it's been a love affair ever since. I remember going to Malaga and standing up in a bar and having the best patatas bravas with my best friends. That's the memories I have of tapas. Always with friends, not always in Spain. I've had good tapas in London as well, though some of the tapas bars in London can be very expensive. And so when I went to Madrid, tapas was obviously top of my list of things to eat, which is a good job really, because there is, I wouldn't say very little else to eat, but tapas is absolutely first and foremost when it comes to eating in Madrid. You don't see a lot of what I would call ordinary restaurants around. What you see is tapas bars everywhere. They are everywhere. And that's not a bad thing, just is. But travelling on my own meant that it was a bit awkward because tapas is communal, it's social. So how was I going to have the tapas experience that I wanted in Madrid on my own? So I decided to go on a tapas tour. You've probably seen these food tours you can book through Vialto or Get My Guide. I booked mine through Get My Guide. Was it Get My Guide? Get Your Guide. Get Your Guide. So I booked a tapas and wine tour because I like wine. And I thought this would be a good way to find out a bit more about tapas from a Spanish guide, to find some of the better spots in Madrid, because it's quite difficult. There's so many options. You just think, well, which one do I go in? I don't really know. It's quite, tapas is quite confusing. If you're not Spanish and you're not used to it, tapas bars are actually quite intimidating. There's no user manual. There's no how do I actually do this? You sort of look and you go in and there's all these people maybe standing by the bar or sitting on bar stools, and they all seem to have food, and yet no one's offering you a menu and there's no menu written down, and you're not quite sure, do I go and order at the bar? Do I wait for someone to come to me? So it's not easy as a traveller. So a tour was going to take away some of that. I'm not going to say stress because that would be the wrong word. Just uncertainty. Make you feel a little bit more at ease and mean that you can actually enjoy it. So what did we eat on the tapas tour, and was it worth it? We ate a lot of different, we had 4 different tapas bars, and we had 3 or 4 choices in each tapas bar. The best was probably the garlic shrimp. The garlic shrimp or prawns, absolutely delicious, fresh as anything. Go in, there's a little tiny bar. Apparently this company actually have 4 other bars on the same street, so it seems small, but actually it's a big company. But the particular site we were in was this little tiny bar, and when you walk in, just on your left-hand side, there is just a small screen and a man standing behind these gas burners cooking these garlic shrimp in a kind of, not ramekin, but the kind of thing that you might cook a creme brulee in. the little dishes. And they just got this whole range of shrimp, and he was adding olive oil, and he's adding the garlic, and the flames are going up, and the only thing you can smell in this place is the garlic. It's just wonderful. And such a tiny little kitchen. I mean, barely the size. I don't know how big it would have been, about a metre by a metre, if that sort of size. And that was delicious, served with bread. You just sort of dip the bread in, and then you eat the prawns, and you just, the whole flavour sensation, actually, to some extent, the bread dipped in this sauce is better than the actual prawns themselves. So the prawns are fantastic. But we didn't start with the prawns. We started in a little delicatessen kind of place that sold, it was a wine and cheese shop, basically. It's a wine and cheese shop that have branched out a bit and put some bar stools and things like this. One of the advantages of going on the tour rather than going in yourself is that you turn up on the tour, they lead you straight through to the back room, there's a table set out. We were about a dozen, and the table's set out for us all, and the food arrives. So you don't have to think about, what am I going to order? What am I going to eat? How do I order? How do I deal with this? How much does it cost? It's all included. Don't need to think about it, which means that you can really concentrate on the food. So we had, in the first place, we had toasts, which were kind of like the size of what I would think of a ciabatta loaf, sliced in half, and then topped. We had 4 different toppings. We had an Iberica ham, which, if you don't know, is the special ham where the pigs are fed on acorns, and it's this most delicious, rich, melt in the mouth ham. Then we had one which was a cheese topped with a quince paste, which is a classic Spanish speciality, is cheese and quince. I love quince. Quince is my absolute downfall. I have quince jelly every morning on my toast, so this quince paste on top of this cheese toast was just fantastic. We had a smoked tuna, which was quite surprising. Nice big slab of tuna that had been sliced and smoked and put on top of this bread. And tasted, one of the other guests said it tasted a bit like meat almost. It was so, the smokiness came into it. And then we had another that was a slice of beef, which is slightly more unusual rather than the ham. It was like a thin slice of beef on top of this toast that again melted in the mouth. And all this was served up with a rather good wine. It was a wine that had, on the bottle it says 150. That's interesting, 150Y in big letters. And it was 150 years. It was this vineyard that's been running for 150 years, and this was their celebration vintage, a celebration bottle of wine. From the Jamia region, and it's a Monastrell wine. Very full-bodied, like a Syrah or a Côte d'Rhône. I like Côte d'Rhône. I like this big, full-bodied wine. So this was great for me. I thought it was fantastic. So it was a really, really good start to the evening. The wine is in generous portions. This was not little tiny cupfuls of wine. This was a proper big glass of wine. And the toasts were, I think we had a plate for 4 people, but there was 4 different varieties, so that meant that you were actually eating the equivalent of this half a ciabatta. So it was quite substantial, you weren't hungry. We went on from there to various other bars. We had one bar where they served a chickpea stew. I think this is a classic from Madrid, this chickpea stew that's normally got pork and things inside it. And this particular bar speciality is tripe. And tripe is one of the things that I struggle to eat. I find it smells a bit like cat food, and I really struggle with it. But promised myself I was going to try everything on this tapas tour, because that was part of the point of it, was eating things that you don't normally eat. So I did. I ate the tripe, and it was melt in the mouth. I wouldn't say it was delicious. It just sort of was there. It soaked up the flavour of the stew. The chickpeas were lovely. The chickpeas were rich and unctuous and a little bit, not really spicy, but they had a lot of flavours inside them. It reminded me quite a lot of like a cassoulet from the south of France, like Toulouse cassoulet, but instead of the sausages, there was this tripe, and instead of the beans, there were these chickpeas. Again, in a kind of ramekin thing with bread to dip in and everything else. We had these little green, they look like green chilies. So I was a little bit like, is this going to be spicy? Because I'm not, be a bit careful with spice because you never know how hot it's going to be. And they weren't spicy. They were like eating a green pepper, a green capsicum, but they're kind of little, look like chilies. So they were nice. We had some deep fried pork, a bit like a pork scratching. If you're from the north of England, then you'll know a pork scratching. These were a bit like big pork scratchings. Very salty. I did find that on this tapas store, and generally when I was in Madrid, one of the problems I had was that the food, there's a lot of fried food and there's a lot of salt. And so I think this is deliberate because it means that you have to drink more. So this is why the wine and the beer tends to flow fairly easily. So we had that. Oh, we had some dogfish. So it was like cubes, and dogfish isn't a fish you see very often, and it was really nice. These cubes of dogfish that had then been deep fried, battered and deep fried. They were surprisingly good. I would have those again. And then we went to another place that was on these were all in the Barrios de las Letras region in Madrid, which is the literary quarter of Madrid, which is where there's a lot of tapas bars, very popular area for the tapas bars. And we kind of walked around that area and then ended up in the Plaza Major, which is the main tourist square that everybody goes to. Now, in general, I don't eat on tourist squares. It's one of my recommendations is if you want good food, you get off the tourist square. If you're eating on the tourist square, you're eating there because of the view, not because of the food. The guide recommended this and said, no, this, it seems like a touristy place to go, but it really is worth it. I do wonder whether they had some sort of deal going with the bar, because honestly, it wasn't the best. The wine wasn't the best. They did offer a cava in that place. Now, if you don't know cava, obviously, if you're British, you probably do, but if you're maybe from elsewhere in the world, maybe you haven't come across cava. It's the Spanish version of champagne. It's actually made whereas Prosecco isn't made in the same way as champagne, it's a sparkling wine, it's not made like champagne. Cava is made like champagne. Doesn't mean it's the same as champagne. It tastes differently because it's got different grape varieties. They add some different things to it, but the actual method, the method champagnoise, is the same. It's the méthode traditionnelle, as we'd say in France. It is different to champagne. I prefer cava to prosecco. That's for sure. I would arguably prefer a champagne. But I stuck with red wine anyway. I think once you're on the red wine, then stay on the red wine is a safe bet, especially after I'd already had 3 big glasses by this point, so I think a 4th big glass was probably safer than mixing. We ended up having a dessert tapas in there, which was a cheesecake, which to me came across as being a bit more like a New York cheesecake. It didn't seem very traditional to me. Interestingly, Americans that were on the same table as me with me on the tour, they disagreed. They thought it seemed very Spanish, so they said it was very different to the New York cheesecake. So that was interesting. In terms of the wine, so we had this first wine from the Gemilla region. We then had a wine that was more a bit more rustic, made by the bar owners. So not necessarily something that you'd choose off a wine list. There was also one of the bars had vermouth on tap, which is interesting. So Spanish vermouth is not like Italian vermouth, and it's not like French vermouth. So it's not as bitter as an Italian vermouth, and it's not as sweet as a French vermouth. Now I always get confused because vermouth, I struggle to separate out vermouth and martini. And the reason why is that vermouth in the UK, the main producer of vermouth in UK is a brand called Martini. So when I was younger, one of the things I used to drink was martini. I actually drank dry martini and lemonade. And that is just a vermouth. It's a type of vermouth. Whereas a martini is a mix of the vermouth with gin, or for a vodka martini with vodka. But because this brand used the name Martini, it's quite difficult to separate out what a vermouth is from a martini. And then, of course, you get the difficulty saying, well, what actually is a vermouth anyway? It's a fortified wine. But if I think of a fortified wine, I would think of something like a port or a sherry. And the difference with a vermouth compared to like a port or a sherry is that a vermouth, rather than sticking with just the wine flavours, it's a fortified wine. So it's a wine that's then had a stronger alcohol added to it, the same way sherry and port has. But a vermouth, the flavours are then coming from the botanicals and the spices that are added into it. And that means that every vermouth is going to be different, because you're going to get different botanicals and different spices added in to make them different. So the Spanish ones, whereas the Italian and to some extent the French vermouths are used as an ingredient more than anything, as an ingredient into cocktails, the Spanish vermouth is drank on its own. It's drunk as an aperitif. And whilst this was tapas, and by now we'd already eaten 3 different courses, it wasn't really an aperitif, because tapas in itself is an aperitif ritual. They drink the vermouth with tapas. So this one particular bar, it was the bar with the prawns. So the bar with the prawns had vermouth on tap. So they made their own vermouth, and rather than it coming in a bottle, it was actually on tap. So yes, this tapas tour, I think it's a great idea. I think it's something that I'm going to look into elsewhere when I travel. I'm going to look into food tours in general. I think Madrid a little bit different because of the tapas culture and because of the way it's confusing, that the tour comes into its own. The tour becomes more important because of that, because it helps and explains. After that, after I'd been on this tour, the next day I did go to a couple of other tapas bars and tried some other things, because now I knew what to have. So I went into one bar and ordered some mixed toast, because again, on my own can't have different things, but this particular bar had a plate of mixed toast, and they had the garlic prawns on top of toast. And that was delicious. That was really good, because the toast itself had soaked up the juices of the prawns, and the prawns were all garlicky, and that was delicious. With a cold beer this time, and I actually think possibly went better with the cold beer. There was also some smoked salmon. There's quite a lot of smoked salmon around in the tapas, even though smoked salmon is not necessarily what you'd think of in Spain. There was quite a lot of it in the tapas. There was some mushrooms. Actually, one thing I would say is that if you're vegetarian, don't worry, there's plenty of tapas that's vegetarian. Honestly, it's whilst they eat a lot of meat, and whilst there is a lot of ham and a lot of seafood involved in the tapas, there's also a lot of vegetarian tapas. So this one was a garlicky mushrooms on toast. I had elsewhere, I had some mushroom croquettes. I had one of the best tapas I had actually was in a rather posh bar. This wasn't what I would think of as a tapas bar, and the slightly more down-to-earth places. This was a bit more well-to-do in an area up near the embassies and things. It was just around the corner from the French embassy, actually. And there I was sitting at the bar, and got the menu, and there was a menu, so I could see what it was, and a very nice barman looked at me and took my menu off me and gave me the one that was in English, which is good because I don't speak Spanish. And on the menu there were lots of things. They call them pintos, which is what they call, it's like a tapas from the northern part of Spain served on bread. So it's a tapas then served on bread. And so they call it a pintos rather than a tapas. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. And there were quite a few options. As I say, these were the higher level restaurant where the options were 15, 20 euro kind of things. And then they had the one option that said it was their world famous tortilla, potato tortilla. And that was like €5. But they said world famous. And I think, well, actually, if you go in a bar that's serving food, or a restaurant that's serving food at a higher level, and then they're claiming that the cheapest item on their menu they are famous for, then you have to try it. It's my principle, and I've rarely been let down by that principle. So this was, and it was kept on the counter. So they have on the counter, there's a glass counter covered with a sneeze thing, but it was a glass counter. It's not refrigerated. And it does say on the menu, this is not served hot or cold, this is served at room temperature. I don't know how that works with food safety. I'm guessing that it's got to stay there for a maximum length of time, and then they have to change it over. So these were on the counter in front of me, and I thought, I'm going to have to try this. Let me tell you, this was the best thing I ate in Madrid. This tortilla was worth the trip to Madrid on its own. I don't know how they do it. I don't know what they did to this tortilla. Now, tortilla is normally, it's quite firm. It's sort of, you slice it. And this was a slice. It was a potato tortilla, potatoes, eggs, vegetables. This particular one was a caramelized onion tortilla. And it wasn't fully set. So the inside was unctuous, and it kind of ran into the toast. And the taste and the texture and honest, just dream, just that kind of comfort food that you get from potatoes and onions all mixed up, but raised to a higher level, raised to something really quite refined. Honestly, this was just fabulous. I would definitely, I'll put a link to it. But go to Madrid just for this. Don't worry about all the other tapas. Great, they're bonus. This potato tortilla is one of, I think it might have to go onto my top 10 list of things I've ever eaten, which is really quite a surprise. And I'm going to have to try and work out how to make it. I make a tortilla. I make tortillas quite regularly, but not like this. And I have to work this out. The potatoes weren't cubed. That was what interesting. The potatoes were kind of sliced, quite a thick slice, but they were sliced rather than cubed, which I thought was interesting. And they didn't taste like they'd been fried as such, but equally they were too unctuous to just be boiled potatoes. I don't know. I need to work this out because they were fantastic. So that is my experience of tapas in Madrid. I will go back, but next time I'd like to take some friends. Tapas needs friends, it needs people, it needs a group. And as I say, that's why the tapas tour was great. I got really lucky. I had a really good bunch of people. I wish we'd exchanged numbers. I did exchange numbers with them. I did exchange Instagram with one of them. So I will do that again. But next time, tapas with other people. Garlic prawns definitely going on my list of rotation. I'll be cooking some garlic prawns in the future. But the potato tortilla, that's the one. That's the one to beat. And I shall be working that one out. Well, thanks for joining me on Eating Europe. If you liked today's episode, share it with a fellow food traveller. And don't forget to subscribe for some more delicious adventures. Until next time, bon appétit and happy travels.